Hello, and welcome to the Whoever Podcast, a Christian podcast for non-Christians. I'm Andrew.
I'm Brian, and today we are starting Mark chapter 7. We're going to read verses 1 through 23, which is a little bit, so stick with us, but it's all important to see the meaning here. So, Mark chapter 7, starting at verse 1. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law had come from Jerusalem, gathered around Jesus, and saw some of his disciples eating foods with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, plates, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders, instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" Jesus replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'The people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules.' You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions." And Jesus continued, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and 'Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death.' But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is korban, that is, a devotion to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that." Again, Jesus said to the crowd and to him, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them." After he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. "Are you so dull?" he asked. "Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body." In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. He went on, "What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person." So that's our passage. A little bit lengthy, but Andrew, you want to walk us through our context?
Yeah, Jesus is continuing his ministry. He's to the point that he's starting to give sermons. He has large crowds that follow him. He's having to even come up with ways to sometimes remove himself from these crowds, and he's using boats to cross the lake and things. His disciples are around him, and so now the Pharisees have taken notice of this. He's become a big enough deal that they're starting to worry about him, at least the local ones. And so they come and they ask him this question. And what they've chosen this time is, hey, we have this rule, this tradition that you should wash your hands ceremonially before you eat. And we've noticed that your disciples don't always do that. Isn't that bad? Why do you let them do that? Why do you let them not follow this rule?
Yeah, and I mean, obviously it's good practice to wash your hands before you eat. Like, that's just common sense. But basically, the Pharisees, they were all about these laws. There were 616, I think, laws in Jewish culture. There's a lot of them. I might be a bit off on that number.
Depending which rabbi they were following.
Yeah, that's true.
They had
that's
different
true.
schools.
But that's my point, though, is that the rabbis then would actually even change some of these laws, not. I shouldn't say change them, but add to them and make them more extreme. So, for instance, if one of the laws said, you're not supposed to work on a Sabbath, then one rabbi might say, well, I think if you take 500 steps on the Sabbath day, then anything more than that would be work. So now you can't take more than 501 steps. So he just added to that law. Some of the Pharisees even believed that if everyone in Israel were to just keep all of the laws for just one day, then the kingdom of heaven would return. So there was this huge emphasis on the law, and the Pharisees were all about the rules, and one of these rules was ceremonially washing before you eat, and it was more of a show than anything. It wasn't really like a sanitary. I mean, the washing was everyone would just put their hands in the same bowl just inside the door. I mean, that's that's not really like any sanitary help there. Maybe it rinses some dirt off, but it was more of a ceremonial kind of thing. And the Pharisees were all about it because it was part of a ceremony. And so they really cared about these traditions and not necessarily about loving people.
Yeah, so the Pharisees' idea, at least at first, was at least somewhat good. They wanted everyone to follow God's law. And then they decided, well, the way to do that is if we have this spot that no one is supposed to go, we'll build a fence around it. Mm-hmm. So we'll expand on these rules. We'll come up with rules that are supposed to make sure that you never really get close to breaking God's law because we have... And then they put another fence around that one. And pretty soon, they had this system of rules and fences that was supposed to be good, but in actuality ended up missing the point. And Jesus' parable that he tells us, he says, hey, you have this system of rules and it's become twisted, so it's a way for you to get out of doing what God wants you to do half the time. You say, well, as long as I do these things, then the spirit of what I'm doing doesn't really matter. I can kind of get away with stuff as long as I'm following the letter of these new laws that we've written for ourselves.
Yeah, and this is what Jesus says. The prophet Isaiah, it says, they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And I think this is really true for a lot of Christians today. And maybe that's a hard message to hear, but I think a lot of times as Christians, we tend to focus on the rules of following God. And we're all about, well, we have to do this, we can't do this, and Christianity has been reduced to just a set of rules. But the truth is that Jesus came to set us free to live life loving Him. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't... Jesus doesn't nullify the law. In fact, Jesus says, no, the law is still important, the rules are important, but the point of the rules isn't just so you can show that you're better than somebody. And the point of following God is not just so you can make other people feel bad. It's not just so you can feel good because you did follow the rules. The point of following God is saying, Jesus, I can't follow the rules, and I need you. Only you have followed the rules perfectly, and I need your forgiveness. And I think that's where we as a church today, we have fallen short because we talk about rules all the time. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like you've been judged by a Christian, or if you're watching this and you don't believe in Jesus, and all you hear about Christians is that you're not supposed to do certain things, I'm really sorry, because that's just not what our faith is about. Our faith is not just a list of things that we are against. It's about loving God and loving people.
Yeah, I mean, what Jesus is talking about is that same idea is in our culture. We'll have groups of people that will say, hey, we think that everybody should follow God. Everybody should do what God wanted, which is a good idea. But then they start making these human rules around their version of what did God say. And quickly you get to the point that you can't find God in any of what they're doing. It's just human rules to try to make people behave pretty much just the way that they want, more even than anything God ever said. Right. God doesn't talk about what style of clothing we should wear, how we should cut our hair, what type of music we should be listening to. These are human ideas that get rolled in with Christianity, and if you've been hit by any of these things and people telling you, well you're wrong, I'm sorry for that. That's not what God said.
And Jesus does, in the scripture we do see that Jesus says, he upholds the rules, and he says, this is wrong, don't do that, but he also accepts people, and it's basically the message that Jesus says is, hey, you're messing up here, you're falling short here, this is not how I designed you to live, but I love you, and I want to help you through the struggle that you're going through. I love you, and I want to help you change. I love you, and I want to transform you into something really amazing. And that's really the message that we as Christians should be teaching, not stop behaving in this way. Like that's not what Jesus does. He does say stop, but he also says, I'm going to help you and I love you even though you do fall short. I think one other important thing in this passage to talk about is how Jesus talks about, in verse 13, he says, nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. And here again, I think, Andrew, you talked about music. As Christians, sometimes we tend to label certain movies or music or ideas or games or whatever it is, we tend to label things as, oh, that's sinful. And what Jesus is saying is, you're like, no, like that in itself isn't necessarily sinful. It's what's coming out of you that's sinful. And there's some nuance here in that, I could listen to music that maybe uses terrible language or something like that, and I'm okay with that because I don't struggle with using crass language. And what Jesus is saying is he's basically saying, like, it's not the stuff that you're taking in that makes you sinful. It's how you then spit that stuff out, how that stuff affects you, and then it comes out of you.
Yeah, when I was choosing a college, I went and visited one that was, you'd call it conservative. And they had a rule that said that you were not to watch movies. Now, my guess is, just like the Pharisees, that rule started because they said, hey, there's some really bad stuff in some of these movies and you shouldn't be watching them. They're not wrong. If you are watching a movie and that movie is causing you to lust, or it's bringing up, maybe because of the violence, there's a lot of anger in it or whatever, if that's having a really negative impact on you, you should stop watching those things.
Absolutely.
That is very true. But a blanket rule that says, because we don't ever want you to see those sorts of things, don't watch any movies at all,
right,
becomes a problem. And for them, because, when they first made that rule, they kind of meant don't go to the movie theater. But then you had movies come out on tapes, and eventually, when I was there, you could stream movies on your computer. And so this rule that said don't watch movies ended up meaning movie theaters and renting movies from Blockbuster and stuff, but as long as you were streaming it, under their rules, it kind of wasn't a movie. So their rule was giving these people permission to watch things that were inappropriate rather than what it was supposed to be doing. So, yeah, rules don't work to mandate morality. We're supposed to be doing that internally. We're supposed to be saying, is what I'm doing of God or is it not? And just because a human rule says it's okay, that doesn't let me off the hook for making my own decision about, am I honoring God by doing this or am I not? Absolutely. No one can tell you sin is okay.
Right. And I think another great example, too, is like bars, for instance. For a very long time, Christians have thought, well, bars are terrible places. You should never go to a bar, right? On the flip side of that, a lot of the conversations I've had with non-believers have been in bars. I used to play in rock bands, and we would play in bars, and some of the best conversations I've gotten to have with non-believers are in those bars. And so by going to a bar, I was able to have conversations with people. Now, while I was in a bar, like, I acted and behaved differently than a lot of the people in the bar. I still didn't, get wasted or get drunk or whatever and get involved in all sorts of, shenanigans and whatnot. But the point is that if we are reducing our faith just to a set of rules, what's going to end up happening is all we're doing is we're just huddling in our own little safety, avoiding the world. And what Jesus wants us to do is he does want us to go into those messy places and engage with people so that we can bring them closer to him. And again, I think that the base, the moral or the point of this is that we're showing love, and in order to show love to people, sometimes we have to be willing to go to them. And the Pharisees, they were setting up these things. We read earlier how the Pharisees were upset that Jesus was eating with sinners and tax collectors. That was breaking one of their fence laws, and Jesus is like, yeah, of course I'm eating with these people. These people are lost. They need to know my love. They need to know me. And I think the same applies true for us today, that we can't be so set on following our own traditions that we're neglecting to show the love of God.
Yeah, in this case, their traditions, Jesus' example was, God says you should honor your father and mother. You should take care of them in their old age. And in this culture, that was all the more true because people didn't really have money and retirement accounts. There wasn't Social Security. Yeah. If you were too old to grow your own food or do your own work, your children were meant to support you. That was how the society worked. And they had come up with these rules that said, well, if I'm really keen on giving money to God, then I should do that, and I cannot honor my father and mother, which is, and Jesus says, no, that's nuts. God told you to do this. You can't honor God by disobeying him. But they had these human rules that said, well, this is normal, this is okay, and therefore we can do it, and they kind of left God out of their equation.
Yeah. And I think that really does apply today in a lot of cases. Maybe I'm going a little too far here, but think about like going to church on Sunday. Most Christians would say, well, going to church on Sunday is a good thing. You got to do that. I'm going to tell you right now that if a Sunday morning comes up and you're planning to go to church, but one of your friends calls you up and says, hey, I'm really struggling with something right now. Can we talk? Go talk to your friend. Like, church is important, certainly, but don't make a tradition the important thing. People are the important thing. I mean, Jesus says that in we could probably do a whole episode on just this, but at one point one of the Pharisees asked Jesus, out of all the laws, which one is the most important? And Jesus says, love God, love people. The whole law is summed up in those two ideas. And so I think that's what Jesus is saying here too. He's like, forget the traditions. Your traditions aren't even actually honoring me. They're just honoring yourselves and making you look good. Forget those. You need to actually love me and love people.
Yep.
I think that's about it, unless you got any other thoughts.
That's good.
If you got any questions, feel free to comment below or reach out to one of us. Until then, we'll see you next time. Bye.